You are lying awake in bed again, not because something terrible happened today, not because you received bad news, not because your life is falling apart. In fact, from the outside, everything might look perfectly normal. But there is a question sitting quietly in the dark beside you, and the strange thing is that you keep refusing to look directly at it. Every time it appears, you distract yourself. You grab your phone. You open another video. You think about tomorrow. You replay an old conversation. You do anything except stay alone with that question for more than a few seconds. Why? Because some questions feel dangerous. Not dangerous because they can hurt your body. Dangerous because they can destabilize the story you tell yourself about who you are. And there is one possibility that many people immediately reject before they even examine it. Not because it has been disproven, not because it has been carefully investigated, but because of what accepting the possibility would require them to confront. Think about the last time someone challenged a belief you held deeply. Maybe it was political, maybe it was moral, maybe it was philosophical. Notice what happened inside you before you responded, before logic entered the room, before evidence was discussed. There was a feeling, a tightening, a resistance, an emotional reaction that arrived faster than reason. Most people imagine they arrive at beliefs through a purely rational process, but psychology paints a far more uncomfortable picture. Human beings are emotional creatures who often use reason afterward to defend conclusions that emotion reached first. And once you notice this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. The person who insists they are completely objective. The person who claims they only follow facts. The person who says they have no emotional attachment to their position. Sometimes, those are the people most deeply controlled by attachments they cannot see. Now consider a different possibility. What if disbelief can sometimes function exactly the same way belief does? What if rejecting something can become emotionally comforting? What if saying there is definitely nothing beyond this world can provide psychological security, in the same way that saying there definitely is something beyond this world can provide psychological security? Suddenly, the conversation becomes more complicated than most people want it to be, because now the issue is no longer whether God exists. The issue becomes whether human beings are capable of separating truth from emotional self-protection. And that question makes nearly everyone uncomfortable. Somewhere in your life you have probably met someone who seemed absolutely certain. They spoke with confidence. They dismissed opposing views immediately. They acted as though the matter had already been settled forever. But certainty is not always a sign of knowledge. Sometimes certainty is a sign of fear. Sometimes certainty is what people build when they cannot tolerate ambiguity. If this idea has ever crossed your mind, even for a moment, leave your perspective below. Not because there is an easy answer, but because the most revealing conversations often begin where certainty starts to crack. Think back to childhood. Imagine a young person asking difficult questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? Why is there something instead of nothing? These questions emerge naturally. They are not taught. They appear on their own. And what is fascinating is that neither belief nor disbelief completely removes them. People carry these questions into adulthood. They simply learn different ways of managing them. Some embrace religious explanations. Some embrace secular explanations. Some spend decades moving between both. Yet beneath every worldview often lies the same human struggle. The struggle to live with uncertainty. The struggle to face mortality. The struggle to create meaning in a universe that frequently refuses to explain itself. Now imagine two people standing in a cemetery. One believes there is something beyond death. The other believes death is the absolute end. From a distance, they appear to have opposite conclusions, but psychologically, they may be wrestling with the same fear. Both are staring at the same reality. Both are confronting the same mystery. Both are trying to make sense of the same silence. And that is where things become interesting. Because many debates about God are not really debates about God. They are debates about fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing identity. Fear of social rejection. Fear of meaninglessness. Fear of eternal consequences. Fear of cosmic loneliness. Fear of uncertainty itself. Human beings are often less concerned with discovering truth than they are with escaping fear. That sounds harsh until you recognize how deeply universal it is. We do it with relationships. We do it with careers. We do it with politics. We do it with our understanding of reality. We cling to explanations that help us function emotionally. Sometimes those explanations happen to be true, sometimes they do not. The difficult part is that emotional usefulness and objective truth are not the same thing. Something can comfort you and still be false. Something can terrify you and still be true. And this creates a problem that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Because once you accept that possibility, you can no longer automatically trust the emotional satisfaction produced by your own beliefs. Imagine a man who spends years insisting there is no God. He laughs at spiritual discussions. He dismisses questions about transcendence. He prides himself on being beyond such ideas. Then one night, he finds himself alone after a devastating loss. Someone he loved is gone. The future he imagined has collapsed. The distractions stop working. The noise fades. And suddenly, he is confronted by questions he spent years avoiding. Not because he became irrational, not because tragedy magically proves anything, but because suffering has a strange way of exposing what people truly believe and what they merely repeat. The same thing can happen in reverse. Someone may spend years convinced of a religious worldview and then experience suffering so profound that old explanations stop satisfying them. Their certainty cracks, their assumptions weaken, their questions multiply. Again, the point is not that one side wins. The point is that human beings are often more fragile, more emotional, and more psychologically complex than they admit. The reason this matters is because fear is rarely obvious. Fear rarely announces itself openly. It disguises itself as confidence. It disguises itself as intelligence. It disguises itself as certainty. It disguises itself as skepticism. Sometimes the loudest rejection is not evidence of freedom from fear. Sometimes it is evidence of fear working overtime. And before you assume this applies only to other people, consider how many times you have instantly rejected an idea without fully examining it. Consider how many times you have felt an emotional reaction before understanding why. Consider how many times you have confused familiarity with truth. There is another uncomfortable possibility waiting beneath all of this. What if some people are not afraid of God existing? What if they are afraid of the implications? Because those are not the same thing. The existence of a higher reality would raise difficult questions about responsibility, purpose, morality, and identity. It would force people to re-examine assumptions they have carried for years. It would demand intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is difficult because it requires admitting that we might not understand reality as well as we think we do. But before rushing toward that conclusion, there is an equally uncomfortable mirror image. What if some people are afraid that there is no God? What if the idea of ultimate meaninglessness terrifies them so deeply that they cannot bear to explore it honestly? Suddenly, both sides are standing in the same room. Both sides are vulnerable. Both sides are human. Both sides are trying to navigate mysteries larger than themselves. And perhaps the most dangerous mistake is assuming fear only exists on the other side. Because the moment you believe you are completely immune to fear, fear gains its greatest advantage. It becomes invisible. It operates without being questioned. It shapes decisions without being noticed. And by the time you realize what happened, years may have passed. The question is not whether fear exists. The question is whether you are willing to see where it hides. Because the possibility that changes everything is not that believers are afraid. It is not that non-believers are afraid. It is that human beings may be far more afraid than they realize. And some of the strongest convictions they hold may be built on foundations they have never truly examined. The deeper realization, the one most people avoid, is still waiting. A few years pass, and something strange begins happening. The opinions that once felt rock solid start feeling less solid. Not necessarily because new evidence appeared, not because a dramatic revelation occurred, simply because life kept happening. You watched people suffer who did not deserve it. You watched good people lose everything. You watched selfish people succeed. You watched promises break, relationships collapse. Illnesses appear without warning. Accidents change entire futures in a single afternoon. And somewhere along the way, a realization began forming that many people never say out loud. Reality does not seem particularly interested in preserving our certainty. No matter what someone believes about God, existence has a way of confronting them with questions that refuse to stay answered forever. This is why some of the most intense internal conflicts happen in silence, not in debates, not in comment sections, not in classrooms, alone. At 3 in the morning, in hospital waiting rooms, during funerals, after heartbreak, during periods of failure, during moments when life becomes impossible to control, because control is one of the most powerful psychological drugs human beings have ever discovered. People crave it. They build routines around it. They organize entire identities around it. They convince themselves they understand what is happening and where everything is going. Then reality arrives and reminds them that they control far less than they imagined. What happens next reveals something important. Some people become more open. Others become more rigid. Some become curious. Others become defensive. Some begin exploring questions they once ignored. Others double down on conclusions they reached years ago. And often the difference is not intelligence. It is emotional tolerance, the ability to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to eliminate it. That sounds simple until you actually try doing it. Imagine sitting in complete silence and asking yourself a question you genuinely do not know how to answer. Not a question you have memorized a response for. Not a question your favorite author answered. Not a question your community already settled. A real question. One that leaves you exposed. One that creates discomfort. Most people last only a few moments before reaching for an explanation. Any explanation. Because uncertainty feels psychologically threatening. The human brain constantly searches for patterns, conclusions, narratives, and meaning. It wants closure. It wants certainty. It wants the story finished. But what if some of the most important questions in existence refuse to provide immediate closure? What if maturity is not found in certainty, but in the willingness to remain honest when certainty is unavailable? This possibility creates a problem for everyone. The believer who thinks every mystery has already been solved. The skeptic who thinks every mystery has already been dismissed. The philosopher who thinks every mystery can be reasoned away. The cynic who thinks every mystery is an illusion. Each of them may be vulnerable to the same psychological trap, mistaking confidence for understanding. One of the most revealing moments in life occurs when someone encounters information that threatens their identity. Not their opinion, their identity. There is a difference. Opinions can change relatively easily. Identities resist change with extraordinary force, because identities are connected to belonging, to community, to self-image, to survival instincts that developed over thousands of years. This is why people sometimes react emotionally to ideas that should theoretically be discussed rationally. The idea is not threatening their logic. It is threatening the structure through which they understand themselves. Imagine someone who has spent 20 years defining themselves as the person who has all the answers. Now imagine that person encountering a question they cannot answer. The question itself is not the real threat. The threat is what the question implies. If they do not know this, what else might they not know? If this assumption is wrong, what happens to everything built upon it? Suddenly, the conversation is no longer intellectual. It becomes deeply personal. And this is where fear becomes fascinating. Because fear is rarely about the thing itself. Fear is often about what the thing might force us to confront. A person standing at the edge of a cliff is not afraid of the cliff. They are afraid of falling. A person avoiding difficult conversations is not afraid of words. They are afraid of consequences. A person rejecting a possibility immediately may not be afraid of the possibility itself. They may be afraid of the transformation that possibility could require. If you have ever experienced this tension, write your perspective below. Not because agreement matters, but because honesty does. Some of the most meaningful insights come from people willing to describe the questions they struggle with rather than the answers they have memorized. Think about the stories people tell themselves. Everyone has one. Some people tell themselves they are independent thinkers who cannot be influenced. Others tell themselves they are seekers of truth. Others see themselves as rational realists. Others see themselves as spiritual explorers. None of these identities are necessarily false. The problem appears when a person becomes emotionally attached to maintaining the identity rather than pursuing reality wherever it leads. Because then evidence becomes secondary, curiosity becomes secondary, growth becomes secondary. Protecting the identity becomes the priority, and this phenomenon appears across every worldview imaginable. It appears in religion, it appears in science, it appears in politics, it appears in philosophy, it appears in everyday life. Human beings often become prisoners of the stories they tell about themselves. The frightening part is that most people never notice it happening. They assume they are pursuing truth while unconsciously protecting comfort. They assume they are being objective while unconsciously defending identity. They assume they are thinking freely while unconsciously obeying emotional incentives they cannot see. Consider a memory from your own life, a moment when you were absolutely convinced about something, completely certain. Then later discovered you were wrong. Think about how that felt. Not the correction itself. The moment before the correction. The confidence, the certainty, the complete inability to imagine another possibility. That memory should humble every human being alive, because it proves something important. Feeling certain and being correct are not the same experience. They can overlap, but they are not identical. And once you understand that distinction, the world becomes far more complicated, yet also far more interesting. Because now every conviction carries a question, not whether it is true or false, but whether you are willing to examine it honestly. Many people spend their lives criticizing beliefs they do not hold, while never examining the assumptions they do hold. They become experts in identifying other people's blind spots while remaining completely blind to their own. But genuine self-examination is uncomfortable. It requires looking inward rather than outward. It requires asking whether your strongest conclusions emerged from evidence, emotion, fear, experience, culture, desire, pain, or some mixture of all of them. And perhaps that is why so many people avoid it. Because if you follow that path long enough, you eventually arrive at a realization that destabilizes almost everyone. You realize that the human mind is capable of deceiving itself in extraordinarily sophisticated ways. Not because people are stupid, quite the opposite. Intelligent people are often better at constructing explanations that protect existing beliefs. They possess more tools for rationalization, more sophisticated arguments, more elegant defenses, more convincing narratives. The result is that intelligence alone does not guarantee honesty. Sometimes it merely improves a person's ability to avoid uncomfortable truths. And nowhere is this more visible than in questions involving meaning, purpose, mortality, and existence itself. Because these questions touch the deepest parts of human psychology. They reach beneath preferences and opinions. They reach into fear, hope, identity, loneliness, wonder, despair, desire. They reach into the emotional foundations of what it means to be human. Which brings us to a possibility that many people never seriously consider. What if the greatest obstacle to understanding reality is not ignorance? What if it is attachment? Attachment to being right, attachment to certainty, attachment to identity, attachment to comfort, attachment to conclusions we reached years ago and never re-examined. Because if that is true, then the real challenge is not proving or disproving anything. The real challenge is becoming the kind of person capable of following truth, even when it threatens everything familiar. And very few people know whether they possess that courage until life forces them to find out. Somewhere ahead lies an even deeper question, not whether fear influences belief, not whether fear influences disbelief, but whether it is possible to encounter the unknown without immediately turning it into something emotionally convenient. And that question changes the entire conversation. Imagine yourself standing alone in a completely dark room, not a room filled with danger, not a room filled with threats, just darkness, total darkness, no distractions, no noise, no opinions from other people, no headlines, no books, no videos, no communities telling you what to think, just you and your own mind. At first it sounds peaceful. Then something unexpected happens. The silence begins speaking, not literally, psychologically. Questions start appearing that are usually buried beneath daily life. Questions that deadlines suppress. Questions that entertainment postpones. Questions that social routines help you avoid. And one of the most uncomfortable discoveries a person can make is that many of the answers they confidently repeat were never fully examined in the first place. They were inherited, absorbed, adopted, reinforced, repeated so often that they started feeling self-evident. This does not mean they are wrong. It simply means familiarity can create an illusion of certainty. And certainty is powerful because it reduces anxiety. Human beings are constantly searching for psychological stability. We want solid ground beneath our feet. We want a framework that helps us interpret suffering, success, love, death, injustice, and the future. The challenge is that reality often refuses to provide the level of certainty we crave. Instead, it offers fragments, experiences, clues, mysteries, contradictions, possibilities, questions. And the way people respond to this uncertainty reveals something profound about human nature. Some people become explorers, others become defenders. Explorers are willing to risk being wrong. Defenders are primarily concerned with protecting what they already believe. The uncomfortable truth is that most people move between both states throughout their lives. They are open-minded in some areas and deeply defensive in others, curious about certain questions and terrified of others. And usually the questions that trigger the strongest emotional reactions are the ones closest to the center of identity. Think about how often people say they want truth. It sounds noble, it sounds admirable, but wanting truth and wanting comfort are not always compatible goals. Imagine being offered a choice. One path guarantees emotional comfort, but may contain falsehoods. The other path guarantees uncertainty, but may lead closer to reality. Which path would most people choose? The answer is not as obvious as it seems, because many people believe they would choose truth, yet spend their lives arranging circumstances that maximize comfort instead. Not because they are dishonest, because they are human. Human beings naturally avoid pain. We avoid existential pain just as much as physical pain. We avoid conclusions that threaten our worldview. We avoid information that destabilizes our identity. We avoid questions that make us feel small. We avoid possibilities that create anxiety. And this tendency exists regardless of what someone believes or does not believe. That is why the deeper issue was never God. The deeper issue was always fear. Not fear in the simplistic sense, not fear as cowardice, fear as a fundamental force shaping perception itself, fear of meaninglessness, fear of judgment, fear of insignificance, fear of responsibility, fear of death, fear of uncertainty, fear of being wrong after investing years in a particular worldview, fear of discovering that reality is stranger than expected, fear of discovering that reality is simpler than expected. Fear can push people toward belief. Fear can push people toward disbelief. Fear can push people toward certainty. Fear can push people toward denial. The direction changes. The mechanism often remains the same. And this realization creates an extraordinary challenge, because once you recognize how deeply fear can influence perception, you can no longer comfortably assume that your own conclusions are completely untouched by it. You are forced into a more difficult position. You must become suspicious of your own certainty, not cynical, not paralyzed, just honest. Honest enough to admit that being convinced of something does not automatically make it true. Honest enough to recognize that emotional conviction can feel identical to intellectual certainty. Honest enough to question your motives as rigorously as you question other people's motives. This level of self-examination is rare because it is uncomfortable. It strips away psychological shortcuts. It removes the illusion that truth belongs exclusively to one group. It forces a person to acknowledge that everyone is vulnerable to self-deception. Everyone. The highly educated, the deeply spiritual, the fiercely skeptical, the intensely rational. No one is exempt. And perhaps that is why the most intellectually humble people often seem less certain than everyone else. They have spent enough time exploring reality to understand how much remains unknown. They have encountered enough complexity to become cautious about absolute declarations. They have learned that certainty sometimes arrives long before understanding does. There is a moment that many people experience at some point in life, though not everyone recognizes it, a moment when the old answers stop working. Maybe it happens after loss, maybe after success, maybe after achieving everything they thought would make them happy, maybe after confronting mortality, maybe after watching someone they love disappear from this world. Whatever the cause, they suddenly realize that the map they were using no longer explains the territory. The explanations that once felt complete now feel partial. The confidence that once felt natural now feels forced. And in that moment, something important becomes possible. Not certainty, curiosity, genuine curiosity. The willingness to ask questions without already demanding a specific answer. The willingness to investigate rather than defend. The willingness to remain open without becoming gullible. The willingness to doubt without becoming cynical. This balance is extraordinarily difficult. Most people drift toward extremes: absolute certainty or total dismissal, complete confidence or complete despair. Yet reality often exists in spaces that are more nuanced than either extreme allows. Maybe that is why some of the deepest thinkers throughout history spent less time making declarations and more time asking questions, not because they lacked intelligence, because they understood the size of the mystery they were confronting, and perhaps that is where the title of this conversation reveals its final twist. You do not believe in God. You are afraid. At first glance it sounds like an accusation, a challenge, a verdict, but what if it is actually a mirror? What if the statement is not about proving anything regarding God at all? What if it is an invitation to examine whether fear influences your conclusions more than you realize? And what if the same mirror must be held up to everyone else as well? The believer, the skeptic, the seeker, the philosopher, the scientist, the mystic, the cynic, the hopeful, the wounded, the confident, the doubtful. Every human being standing before the same vast mystery, trying to make sense of existence with limited information, limited perspective, and a mind shaped by emotion as much as reason. Suddenly the conversation changes. It is no longer about winning an argument. It becomes about understanding ourselves. Because the most frightening possibility is not that your conclusion is wrong. The most frightening possibility is that you never honestly examined why you reached it in the first place, that you spent years defending a position without fully understanding the emotional forces supporting it, that you confused confidence with truth, familiarity with accuracy, repetition with understanding. The challenge, then, is not to abandon belief, not to abandon disbelief, not to adopt a particular worldview. The challenge is deeper, to become radically honest about your own psychology, to ask whether your convictions are serving truth or protecting comfort, to ask whether your certainty emerged from investigation or avoidance, to ask whether there are questions you secretly fear exploring. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: if reality turned out to be different from what you currently believe, would you want to know? Sit with that question long enough and something interesting happens. The conversation stops being about religion. It stops being about ideology. It stops being about labels. It becomes a question about courage. The courage to face uncertainty, the courage to confront fear, the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, the courage to admit when you do not know. Because maybe the opposite of fear is not belief. Maybe the opposite of fear is not disbelief. Maybe the opposite of fear is honesty. And honesty begins the moment a person stops asking whether other people are afraid and starts asking whether they are.